And I'm Stefano, the Chief Intelligence Officer of Artorias. And today we're joined by Joe from Natsecboogie, a phenomenal X, formerly known Twitter account that covers Mexican cartels. And I'm very excited to have him on today. Joe, welcome aboard.
Stefano and Matt, I'm glad to be here.
So, Joe, before we go into the details of kind of this major breaking news that happened last week, I'd like to give you an opportunity to introduce your team and kind of explain a lot of the great work you do. Because for those who don't know, in my Twitter account, All Source News, I heavily rely Joe and his team's work. I think he does phenomenal work geolocating Mexican cartels. I think in the geo confirmed cartel page, it's easy to say, Joe, you and your team are probably 99% of all geolocated events. So please, Joe, explain to our listeners what you cover and what's your team made of.
Yeah, so me, as well as 666 and Prop, we've been doing geolocations for, man, I would say like it's almost coming on a year now, primarily focused on cartels in Latin America. I think one of the first geos that we did that I think that's where you found us, All Source, Stefano, was when we did that geolocation for Eliseo Imperial Castro or Cheo Anthrax back in like May of last year. And, we kind of saw there was kind of this void when it comes to OSINT related to what was going on with the cartels. Every single day we see geolocations throughout the world and Ukraine, and Israel and Palestine, as well as in Syria. And we just kind of were like, well, nobody's really doing this in Mexico. So why don't we try to see if we can't geolocate some things? And eventually we found ourselves doing more and more every single day, week. And we got a little bit burnt out there. But, the three of us have kind of continued that. And thankfully we have some other people doing geolocations like Obscuro Media and Halipon. Those guys are great, and they've also helped out pick up some of the load. And one of the other things we kind of focus on outside of geolocations is just cartels and non-state actors using emerging technologies, primarily drones and counter drone technology, as they either fight against each other or their states, governments. So that's a little bit about the three of us and what we do.
And I think, Joe, you hit up an excellent point that, I mean, not only in the OSINT community, just I think even just in general, I mean, you and I were talking about in the background, right, where kind of the analysis, both from the media, even Mexican press in a lot of cases, and especially kind of the think tank. And if you look at it from the American perspective, it's clearly lacking on, Mexican cartels and even some of the detailed analysis. We've talked about that these think tanks and news organizations you would expect, for example, if you're talking about, let's say, Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Palestine, you'll see in-depth reporting, and that in many ways, unfortunately, is lacking in cartel coverage, specifically in Mexico. I mean, sometimes you have very interesting exclusive and scoops and investigative reporting, but it's very small and far between. And I think this is something that with this podcast, we hope our listeners understand that there's a team out there of accounts on X that do phenomenal work that are probably the prime experts on Mexican cartels. I mean, you named a few. Borderland Beat is a phenomenal news organization that does a lot of amazing investigative reporting and detailed analysis. And I think it's important for people to understand that a lot of the heavy hitting on Mexican cartels, not only in the English side, but even in the Spanish side, is done by anonymous accounts on Twitter or X. And they push a lot of this reporting, tracking cartel social media, tracking the latest events. And a lot of the experts, it's kind of ironic, you and I were talking about it. I mean, Joe, we can probably think in the top of our heads, like if we wanted information from, let's say, Tamaulipas, we have 2, 3, 4, 5 accounts on X that we know exactly who to go to. It's not the reporters, it's not the named news organizations. Like we know exactly who to ask about those questions. Same for Sonora, Sinaloa. And I think that's a very interesting dynamic in Mexican Twitter, right? How there's accounts that either focus on specific cartels or focus on regions, and they become the subject matter experts much more so than any news organization out there. But with that being said, I think with you here, I think that's an important conversation that I would like to have is, we haven't really talked about the Chapitos from the Sinaloa cartel, one of the factions of the Sinaloa cartel and the Jalisco New Generation cartel. This alliance they announced last week. And I think that's something that, Joe, I'd like to give you your initial reaction and what you think that is all about.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it was probably almost a little bit less than half a year ago, right? We saw that first little, Chapitos and CJNG alliance. They had that AI generated patch with, the rooster and the pizza on it. And everybody was like, yeah, I guess that would make sense with the Culiacanazo going on between the Chapitos and Maiza. That maybe they would align, but it was kind of more of a, yeah, that would make sense, but probably will never happen. And now we are at the point where no, this is a thing. This alliance actually does exist. I believe that you posted that video showing a large number of Chapitos members basically like boasting about it, boasting about alliance with CJNG, which, is says a lot, I think, that, Ivan and the Chapitos feel like they maybe need this alliance a little bit with the way their internal struggle between the Maiza and Chapitos is going on. So it definitely was something that they said was going to happen in the past, but I think everybody just kind of blew it off. But now we are here and it is a real thing. And so it's definitely going to be interesting to see the way this emerges, including like, and I'll let you speak on it more, but like it's not just the Chapitos and the CJNG that are in this alliance. There's other groups that are a part of it.
Yeah, and I think that's something that is can really change. And we'll go more into detail of that in a little bit. But I mean, I think what this alliance shows, because that video, one of the interesting aspects when they mention it is, for our listeners who, obviously visually we'll try to explain this right now, is that it was a, what, 2-3 dozen gunmen. I mean, it's a very large, probably even more formation. And there was two men with their hands tied and blindfolded. And they gave kind of this speech, and what they actually said, in Spanish, translated to English, something along the lines of, "The rumors are true." Right, alluding to what you're saying, Joe, because there was this long rumor of this CJNG Chapitos alliance, some narco banners, etc. And what they said is the rumors are true. Chapitos and CJNG now have an alliance. And then they said something along the lines, we're now El Mencho's people and Ivan's people, El Mencho being the leader of CJNG and Ivan being Ivan Archiva, the leaders of Chapitos. Right. And that kind of confirmed this statement. I mean, I've had people reach out to me specifically before the videos was published. I had a source of mine indicate, hey, a video is coming confirming the alliance, because prior to the video, one of the interesting aspects I started noticing was CGNG associated social media accounts actually started to push Chapito propaganda. Right. And before that, we would see the narco banners, some messaging here and there. They kind of loosely called themselves, and it would be interesting to see if this is kind of the official name they went through, but they called themselves Fuerza Especiales Union, or the kind of the Union Special Forces. And that's how they, were kind of alluding to this alliance. And this video statement was the final confirmation, was like the official statement that has been widely accepted to be credible. And since what we've seen then is subsequent reporting, basically stating specific factions. I mentioned this in some of the videos I do, is Luis Chaparro, a journalist with Pie de Nota, a phenomenal YouTube channel, and also on Twitter. He in his page alluded to kind of the details of this alliance, where clearly El Mencho and specific factions and leaders under El Mencho, like El Sapo, El Jardinero, etc., were going to commit hundreds of soldiers or sicarios to support Los Chapitos. And so clearly the structure of the alliance is Los CGNG is being sent to support Los Chapitos. So CJNG is kind of the powerful one, right? And Los Chapitos are kind of the subordinate organization in this alliance. But now we're actually seeing videos of members of CJNG fighting against members of Mayito Flaco in areas that CJNG has never historically played a role in, like specific areas in Sinaloa and Durango specifically. We're seeing violence of members of Los Jardineros look like targeting members of Los Cabreras, which is kind of a group that has aligned themselves very heavily with the Mayito Flacos. And that's an interesting dynamic. And I think it goes to this question of this desperation that Ivan Archibaldo had because he was losing. Ivan Archibaldo was losing the Sinaloa Cartel Civil War. He was losing key lieutenants. He had factions abandon him. He had a riot, one that used to be Chapo Isidro. For those who don't know, Chapo Isidro was more of an independent actor previously and kind of associated with the BLO, the Beltran Lavan organization, that split with the Sinaloa cartel very violently. He kind of played a very neutral role because he was operating in northern Sinaloa. Chapo Isidro then started to attack members of Los Chapitos, specifically La Numerada, even El Perris, who was recently killed. They were key leaders of Los Chapitos. And I think a lot of events, I think the video statement happened because in a week time frame prior to that video announcement, it was just bad news after bad news after bad news from Los Chapitos. And I think this was his attempt to kind of change the narrative. It was interesting, though, that as I alluded to, Perris, who was the leader basically of kind of the Los Chapitos head of security, he replaced El Nini, who was captured in 2024. Perris took over the role of the security head for Los Chapitos. He was killed after that announcement, right, by Mexican soldiers. Clearly, Ivan Archibaldo still has a lot of challenges. But I think, Joe, the question I would have for you is, I think CG&G is saving him right now. The question is, do you think that this is something that Ivan Archibaldo can kind of utilize to gain back the power and the status that he's lost? Or do you think that regardless, even with this alliance, Ivan Archibaldo days are numbered either by los Mayito Flacos or the Mexican federal government?
I mean, that's a great question because at this point, like Ivan, has made a deal with the devil, in allying himself with historically, Cartel de Sinaloa's largest competitor when it comes to all of their illicit businesses. And he has made the decision to say, hey, I'm going to have to go to El Mencho to get support if I want to win the Culiacanazo and actually gain back territory. And so but to your question, I think Ivan's days are numbered. It has been abundantly clear that at both the state and federal level, the Mexican government, while not, I would never say that they were openly siding with La Maiza and Mayita Flaco, but they have made it a point that they are primarily going after Chapitos members, Chapitos leadership. We, just like you just mentioned, La Paris just was killed in an operation in Navalato. And so if you're Ivan, the walls have to feel like they're closing in at this point. You probably don't know who all you can trust, especially after, the government just killed La Paris, because you have to imagine that the Mexican government was able to get their hands on a number of things, cell phones, other records, and if you're Ivan, I said this earlier to the other two guys and we kind of posted it, like the second that he was killed, I guarantee you Ivan was on the move. And I don't know that he could probably trust going to maybe some of the safe houses that he normally goes to, because he doesn't know what the Mexican government was able to exploit from some of that. So cell phones or other things that were found there. So, he is definitely in a position where I feel like his back is against the wall, and it's going to come down to, one of two things, is the Mexican government going to arrest him, or is La Maiza going to find him and, put an end to Los Chapitos, that element of the Cartel de Sinaloa?
And so you indicated, Stefano, that this might be somewhat a sign of weakness. There's a reason that they're looking for this partnership. So my question to you, Joe, would be, do you think this is something that's going to last? And can you expand on if this might be for you or Stefano, on the differences between leadership and territory? Do you think there is still some level of competition between these groups? Do you think this is a true alliance, or do you think that this is just the type of thing that they're trying to take advantage of the moment and solidify their positions?
I mean, I think at this point, I think that everyone kind of agree that, Cartel de Sinaloa isn't going to exist as it existed in the past anymore. That's just, it's dead. And what comes out of it will end up being, something different, and something probably a little bit more unique. But I don't, once Ivan went to El Mencho and CJNG for help, they at that point become, in our opinion, I talked to the guys about this, like they're subservient to CJNG. So let's say somehow, some way, CJNG assists those Chapitos and they turn the tide, and they end up winning this internal civil war within the Sinaloa cartel. It's not like Ivan says, like, okay, thanks El Mencho for the help. We're going to go back to being your rival competitor anymore, because that just wouldn't make sense. El Mencho is not going to be like, we just helped you out, and now, yeah, you can go back to competing us with, like, drug trafficking, or the distribution of illegal oil and gasoline, or one of the other various types of illicit businesses that they have. It just doesn't make sense that it would end up going that way. So I think this was definitely an alliance of survival for Ivan and Los Chapitos, and I think this was a opportunity seen by CJNG to kind of expand their network, expand their territory, and expand all their business dealings. But I'll let Stefano kind of step in and add his 2 cents.
No, I mean, if I may, Joe, because you didn't want to go there, let me go there. I 100% believe that the Mexican federal government has picked a side in this civil war since the beginning, and they picked a side of the Maito Flacos. I mean, it's pretty clear in my opinion. Like, and I think this kind of goes to the internal dynamic of how the Mexican government view things. There's probably a million different reasons, as I talked about this, but regardless of the reasoning, of both nefarious and non-nefarious reasons, that the Mexican federal government has picked the Maito Flacos and have sided with los Maito Flacos and are targeting los Chapitos much more than any other group. Having said that, I mean, I think that's kind of the very interesting dynamic, Matthew, that this question of this idea that how long this alliance lasting, and I think it will, because at some point, I think the question then becomes, I mean, who are los Chapitos? Let's say, for those, let me just backtrack a little bit. I think it's important to highlight los Chapitos are the sons of El Chapo, right? There's four brothers and four sons that form los Chapitos from El Chapo directly, right? Who's in U.S. prison. You have Ivan Archibaldo and Jesus Alfredo, and then you had Ovidio Guzman and then Joaquin Guzman, right? The same name as the father. Ovidio Guzman and Joaquin Guzman are in prison. So now you have Ivan Archibaldo and Jesus Alfredo. Ivan Archibaldo, without a doubt, is the key leader. Like, he's the one that Los Chapitos look up to, right? Because Ovidio Guzman had a specific faction under Los Chapitos, a specific armed groups, right? That were easily, because Ovidio Guzman's nickname was El Raton, so they had the mouse emoji. And that was kind of how you would associate factions within Los Chapitos called, from Ovidio Guzman. But when Ovidio Guzman was detained, really the only brother left with the charisma to lead Los Chapitos is Ivan Archibaldo, right? If Ivan Archibaldo gets captured or killed, Jesus Alfredo's not stepping up. I find it, I mean, he could, but it's not, I don't think anybody's going to look at Jesus Alfredo as this very dynamic, charismatic leader like Ivan Archibaldo. And Ivan Archibaldo really has kind of that charisma and that gall really to kind of lead a major cartel. And so the question then becomes, okay, well, you're looking at the leadership of Los Chapitos And they're slowly losing key leaders that may be able to replace Ivan Archibaldo if he were to fall, right? Like the perfect example is El Nini, right? So El Nini is somebody that I could see as, before he was captured last year, as a clear successor from Ivan Archibaldo. And well, he's gone. So if Ivan Archibaldo falls, I mean, really the question then is who's left, right, to really take over? And I think that's where El Mencho made the calculation. Because in El Mencho's mind is, this is a win-win for me. It's a win-win. Either Los Chapitos win the war, and now Chapito is basically subservient to me, and I get all that territory. And more importantly, he expands his drug production areas that he controls, with Ivan Archibaldo serving as kind of this chief, kind of this little fiefdom under him. Or if Los Chapitos lose, there are a large segment of Los Chapitos who will not go to Mayito Flaco. And so they will go to him. And that expands his territorial control. And then if anything, it even enables him as another area that he can still challenge Los Mayito Flacos, which is the main rival of El Mencho, right? Probably right now the main rival. And so from El Mencho's perspective, I do believe this is a long-term alliance, because even if Los Chapitos die as a cartel, the remnant of Los Chapitos will just get absorbed by Jalisco New Generation. So that structure of the alliance, it no longer becomes an alliance, it becomes an absorption. And I would almost make the argument that we're getting there already, where Los Chapitos are going to slowly but surely be absorbed within the larger construct of the Jalisco New Generation cartel. And then, that is something that I think a lot of people aren't really analyzing, how this alliance and the dynamic with CJNG can fundamentally change cartel dynamic and create a 800-pound gorilla south of our border, with it being the most powerful drug cartel right now in Mexico, and more importantly, the drug cartel that has the most international reach internationally.
So at the end of the day, you think this is more of a slow motion overtaking by the CJNG of Chapitos, but you basically see it as inevitable, whether or not the leadership stays or goes.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, look, Ivan Archibaldo made this deal because he had no other choice. That's the reality. Ivan Archibaldo didn't have a choice. He was done. Okay, let's look at the week prior to this announcement. You had Chapo Isidro of the BLO from Northern Sinaloa initiate offensive operations against key leaders of Los Chapitos, specifically La Numerada and Perris in Northern Sinaloa. You had Mayito Flaco continue to press Los Chapitos in Eastern and Southern Sinaloa. You had reporting that Los Yucos, which was a key Chapito faction that had familiar bloodline relationship with Los Chapitos, switched side from Los Chapitos to Mayito Flaco. Right? That was reported, that Los Yucos switched side. So you had this week prior to this of major losses. And what happens? I think there was concern that at some point, it's just the entire organization was going to collapse in some way. Not maybe it wasn't. I don't think it was going to be like the Syria but Bashar al-Assad collapse, but the writing was on the wall, right? And so I think he made this deal. And it's interesting that the death of El Perris, who I think is important to highlight, although was a key leader within the organization of Los Chapitos, he was losing influence within Los Chapitos, right? He never got to the level of El Nini, his predecessor. He never got to that level of influence, but he was losing that power, even the smaller one that he had. But it's interesting that I think prior to the announcement of this alliance, I think the death of El Perris would have been a significant blow for Ivan Archibaldo by the Mexican military who killed them. But the fact that he made that alliance with CJNG, and CJNG then sent military forces to support Los Chapitos, it kind of absorbed that loss of El Perris. And I think that's the goal of El Mencho in his mind, is that eventually I'm absorbing these people under my command infrastructure. Be it drug production, drug manufacturing, drug distribution, control of territory, eventually what you're going to see is this absorption. And it's funny because I saw a video, and I have no way of confirming this, but it's an interesting concept, which was, there was conversations and a hypothesis that Culiacan was not going to fall under the territorial control of los Chapitos within this alliance, but was going to fall within a specific leader of CGNG based out of Michoacan. And I look at that and how I analyze it, it's like we might disagree if the reporting is true or not, and we try to research it. But what I couldn't say was that's impossible, because that's well within the realm of possible outcomes. And to be honest, that could even be a very likely outcome within that absorbing of the Chapitos, that even Ivan Archibaldo himself is forced to operate under the guise of, let's say, a plaza boss out of Michoacan that has been dispatched to support los Chapitos in Sinaloa. And so, when I looked at that report, I mean, there's a lot of people that I'm looking at. I don't necessarily believe the CGNG in Michoacan is the one I would be looking at. I'm looking at a specific faction called Los Jardineros, which are based in Jalisco and Nayarit, because and the leader of that group, the reason they're called Jardineros is because the leader is called El Jardinero. He's the key lieutenant of El Mencho. He historically has had a lot of relationship with Los Chapitos, especially since the Civil War started, that there was even conversations that Los Chapitos and El Jardinero announced a ceasefire. And so Mayito Flaco then was the one who was fighting both Los Chapitos and El Jardinero by himself. I am looking at him because the territories he controls along Mexico's Pacific coast are right there with Sinaloa. And I think in El Jardinero's mind, although El Mencho is clearly leading this, within the internal power dynamics of CGNG, I think Jardinero also views this as a prime opportunity to expand his influence within the Jalisco New Generation cartel and absorb most of the infrastructure of Los Chapitos. But regardless, as the bigger picture, I think El Mencho wants to absorb Los Chapitos, and he can either do it by winning, ensuring that the Chapitos win, or even if the Chapitos lose, he's gaining a lot more than he had before.
That's definitely an interesting thought. I didn't even think of El Jardinero actually being the one that would end up ultimately, if the Chapitos were able to win. I think it would be more of a situation where Ivan is the figurehead, but someone from CJNG is just standing over his shoulder telling him, we are doing this, and if you don't like it, we can put your head in an OXO box. I do have a question for you, Stefano. What do you think, why do you think the Mexican government has decided to side with La Maíza? Do you think it was the fact that they were embarrassed after, Mayo Zambada got flown to the U.S. By one of El Chapo's sons? Or I'm just interested in...
No, I think it's a multitude of reasons, right? So the immediate reaction from the Civil War, I think, is that it's the Los Chapitos were the ones who caused the Civil War to happen, right? And the fact that Maya Zambada was extradited to the United States without the knowledge of the Mexican federal government, I think that did them no favors. But I think there's already a history of bad blood with Los Chapitos since the AMLO administration, right? Because of the Culiacanazo, right? Because the Culiacanazo 1.0 was a huge embarrassment for AMLO, and he was furious. Now, I think it's important to highlight that Los Chapitos are the main fentanyl pushers into the United States, right? So there was even political pressure from the United States against Los Chapitos. So I think AMLO had a multitude of reasons to say, I'm done with Los Chapitos. That's why we saw Culiacanazo 2.0 when they actually captured Ovidio Guzman, right? So there was already this bad blood. When the Civil War happened, I think the Mexican federal government, the Maya Zambada piece, but two, violence skyrocketed in Sinaloa. And I think the Mexican federal government, from a non-nefarious point of view, said, we need the violence to end. The quickest way to end this is to make sure one side wins the Civil War. So let's just go with who we won, the stronger of the two factions, which without a doubt, it was always los Mallito Flacos. And then two, avenge this embarrassment that they did. So I think there's a multitude of reasons, but if you look at all the targeted operations that los Chapitos, the Mexican federal government did, it was always against los Chapitos and not Mallito Flaco.
We've been talking a lot about the Chapitos CJNG alliance. So if you're Mallito Flaco, do you start looking towards other cartels for assistance? Because in Sinaloa, they probably have a handle on it, but does Mallito Flaco reach out to La Familia Michoacana or Carteles Unidos or CDN up in Tamaulipas and Nueva Leon at this point?
I love this question because this is something you and I were talking via DM. So I appreciate, the ability to speculate publicly, and I think that's an interesting conversation, right? How I analyze it is, you got to give kudos first of all to Jalisco New Generation because they have mastered the ability to form alliances and then absorb groups underneath it. Right. And actually, I was thinking of this example. I was like, holy shit, this is how they can do it with Los Chapitos. Look at the metros and the Gulf Cartel, right? So the Gulf Cartel had a civil war. You had Scorpion Group out of Matamoros, which borders Brownsville. You had the metros in Reynosa, which borders McAllen, Texas, right? Violent civil war. Here comes Jalisco New Generation Cartel that then managed to leverage Primito, the leader of Los Metros, who everybody historically viewed as the leader of a Gulf Cartel faction. And they formed an alliance, this Gulf Cartel faction, the Metros formed an alliance with Jalisco New Generation, right? And so the key alliance there was Los Metros, and then another group called the Old School Zetas, or the Zetas Viejas Escuelas, had an alliance then with CGNG in the violent war they had against Grupo Escorpión. Until recently, there was a ceasefire, and then CDN, right? Well, the Treasury Department, in sanctions against Primito, basically said Primito is not a leader of a Gulf Cartel faction. He is CGNG's leader in Tamaulipas. And I think that could be an interesting dynamic of how they do it with Ivan Archibaldo. Is following, look at Primito. And then you follow that same model, you can now follow it with Ivan Archibaldo. And that's how an alliance can then become a leader. So it's almost to the point where Ivan Archibaldo can become, because he has no other choice, or because he needs it to survive, to become the CGNG leader in Sinaloa, where now CGNG has control of Culiacan. That's an insane statement. But if you look at the Primito example, you can see a very similar story developing with Ivan Archibaldo. And I think time will tell if that happens. And then the other question is, well, how long does Ivan Archibaldo have? Because clearly the Mexican federal government is after him. They were very close in capturing him. And I think that's kind of the next thing. So then who does El Mencho then identify within the remnants of Los Chapitos to be that plaza bar? Could it be a Jesus Alfredo? Because Jesus Alfredo is a very weak man. Let's be real. So then if Ivan Archibaldo falls, doesn't Jesus Alfredo become in charge of Los Chapitos because of El Mencho's backing, because he has the fighters? But then he tells Jesus Alfredo, on paper, you're Los Chapitos, and your propaganda say you're Chapitos, Sinaloa cartel, viva El Chapo. But Jesus Alfredo, you're my guy in Sinaloa. And to be honest, Jesus Alfredo is probably going to take it. And the ultimate irony of all this, El Mencho kidnapped, way back years ago, kidnapped Jesus Alfredo. And it took El Chapo and Mayo Zambada direct negotiation to have them freed. And now you can run into a situation where it's very possible where Jesus Alfredo follows a similar footstep as Primito, or even Ivan Archibaldo himself follow a very similar footstep and then become the CGNG leaders of Sinaloa. And I think that's how El Mencho is doing it. And so from the Mallito Flaco's point of view and perspective, how do they respond to this? Because what you're seeing is, and this is going to the genius of the Jalisco New Generation, is they're able to form very important alliances to expand their reach, because on paper, the Jalisco Generation Cartel doesn't control significant border territory, but they have very good relationships with the Arellano Felix organization. They have which is the Tijuana Cartel. They have very powerful alliances with the Juarez Cartel, right? La Línea. And then they have now los metros are CGNG, right? Because on paper, again, they don't control the borders, but because they have very strong alliances, they're able to be one of the largest, if not the largest, drug pusher into the United States without actual territorial control. But because of these alliances they have with other groups, right? And so the alliances that could be forming in Mexico is basically twofold. You can see a scenario where, because los Chapitos in La Línea, who had violence historically, especially along the border areas of Sonora and Chihuahua, because Chihuahua is the historical territory of the Juarez cartel, los Chapitos announced a ceasefire with La Línea. And that does appear to be true, right? But that ceasefire can then incorporate La Línea into this alliance with los Chapitos and Jalisco New Generation. And then the question then becomes, well, how does Mayito Flaco respond? Well, Mayito Flaco has very intense business dealings with CDN. Does Mayito Flaco then say, I have no other choice but to form an alliance now between more than just a business relationship? Do I form a strategic alliance with CDN? Because CDN is fighting Los Metros, which are CGNG and Tamaulipas, right? So the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Mayito Flaco is fighting La Línea in Chihuahua. So does CDN then, hey, Mayito Flaco commits to help CDN against Metros, CDN then helps to commit forces to support Mayito Flaco against La Línea, right? And so that's one potential area. Another interesting aspect that we haven't really talked about is Grupo Scorpion, or the Scorpion Group. They've kind of laid low. They have a ceasefire with the Metros. They haven't really done much. But Grupo Scorpion's historical rival has always been Zetas Viejas Escuelas and Los Metros, which are allied and part of CGNG, right? So there's an aspect where Grupo Scorpion said, hey, I don't really have a problem with Mayito Flaco. So do I also, is there a area of cooperation can we have there? And then to the other groups you mentioned, like Carteles Unidos, who are fighting a very violent war against CJNG in Michoacán, and then La Nueva Familia Michoacana, La Familia Michoacana, also, right? And I think that's kind of the interesting aspect where the Chapitos CGNG alliance has the ability to then kind of ironically stop the splitting of these groups. And now you're going back to what we saw historically, which always happened in Michoacan, these alliances forming to fight a common enemy. Right? We saw it with Los Zetas back in the day, and then we saw Carteles Unidos do it now, but with Jalisco New Generation. Now, do you see that all across Mexico? Because that's what I think people don't understand. The Chapito Jalisco New Generation Cartel Alliance fundamentally transformed and changed cartel dynamics that might require these groups to respond with their own alliances. But again, don't underestimate Mayito Flaco. He's been doing very well against CJNG and Zacatecas, extremely well against CJNG and Zacatecas. So maybe in his mind, and again, he's the young guy. He's the young blood. He's the new leader on the block. He wants to make his name in for himself, right? He's taking on CJNG and Los Chapitos. I don't know if he really necessarily believes he needs to have an alliance. So maybe he does, and he just decides to go this solo and expand business relations with other cartels. But that's something that I would be looking for.
You two have outlined a very complex web of relationships and conflicts between these various cartels. First of all, what is the United States' role in combating this? What do they like? What's the best picture scenario for them? And why do you think that there's this lack of in-depth coverage that really breaks down and outlines for the American people just how complex it is? Because cartels seems to be a catch-all. It's not something that is easy to digest, but I do think that there is definitely room for a higher level of coverage to explain the situation to the south of the border, the American people. And that's not really something that we see. So how do you see this playing out in the near future? I know there have been certain deals with certain cartels. There have been letter writing campaigns between some of the people who are in prisons and the Mexican government and the United States government. What do you see in the near future, and what should people be looking for?
Joe, one of the things, if I may, before you jump in, I do want to kind of just highlight something that Matthew was alluding there to is, and then I'll let you answer the rest. I find it very interesting that people say since the Trump administration came back into power, right? Trump 2.0, cartels, cartels, cartels. But the actual coverage of Mexican cartels, although it has gained more focus, hasn't improved in any way, shape, or form. And if any, I mean, the only thing we're really seeing is maybe misinformation being spread a lot more about the topic. It's kind of ironic, like the cartel aspect, from a misinformation perspective, globally and from a U.S. point of view, was not that high. The very famous Russia claim of Ukrainian weapons and Mexican cartels and that AT4 that the Scorpion Group have, which was all debunked and lies and bullshit. But for the most part, most people didn't really fall for that type of level of misinformation. The most amount of misinformation was very cartel specific, and unless you're a very astute observer, you really wouldn't catch that it's misinformation. I don't know if there's any real attempt. I'm not hopeful that cartel coverage is going to get better in the United States. I'm just going to be flat out honest. I have noticed, Joe, you too, some news organizations have reached out to us because they want to make sure they get the story right. But and a lot of podcasters and YouTubers who really want to focus professionally on cartel coverage have reached out to try to make sure they get the most information. But there hasn't really been any attempt, and even in where you would think in American think tank policies and stuff like that, they don't go into the details necessary unless you get from somebody from Mexico that has a very deep understanding of kind of Mexican cartels. You're not going to get an improvement. And to be honest, I haven't really seen any attempt to improve it. But Joe, go ahead.
It's actually like the three of us talk about it a lot over at Natsecboogie, but it's very ironic to us that there is so little coverage on what goes on as far as the cartels in the United States for a multitude of reasons, right? Like the second most common language spoke in the United States outside of English is Spanish. It's also our direct neighbor, a country that we share a border with. And it's not like the violence is so far from the border that it's just not anybody knows about or pays attention to. No, like you literally will have sicarios kill a rival cartel member right across the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo, quite frequently. Gunfire is heard in the streets of, Laredo, Texas, or Brownsville, coming from the Mexican side of the border. I think a lot of the reason why there's not a lot of coverage is because people have misconceptions, and a lot of that's fed from misinformation and disinformation. Like, all the entire Mexican government is corrupt. The entire Mexican military is corrupt. They're all like the federales, which isn't really that true, right? You have the Mexican army and the Mexican Marines and the Fuerzas Especiales of the Mexican government, fighting every single day in the various states in Mexico against these cartel members and laying it on the line. I'm not saying that corruption doesn't exist in the Mexican government, because it definitely is, and it's definitely something that needs to get addressed. And hopefully President Scheinbaum will take that seriously. But, the other thing is all Mexicans are, drug peddlers, or they're somehow involved with the cartels, is another trope that we see and hear constantly. So I think a lot of it's just that's just Mexico. And that's the reason why you don't see a lot of coverage in the US media. And then frankly, just like you kind of laid out, Matthew, is it's complicated. It is an extremely complicated topic. And there are a lot of good people out there with great information. But their voices don't carry as much as some of the mainstream media or some of the maybe larger accounts. That's why the three of us are super appreciative of what Stefano does with All Source News and his account, and how large it is, so he can actually be some truth. Anytime the three of us see any disinformation getting pushed out or misinformation, we go straight to Stefano. We're like, hey man, did you see this? Can you believe they're actually saying this? And then he's like, give me a second. I got to send a post real quick. And then, that kind of calms the waters. But like Stefano laid out, I think that if the coverage increases, there's probably going to be a large swath of disinformation pushed out by, accounts that just frankly just don't know about the topic, but they just want to push it out, and they have large followers. And it's definitely something that, we're constantly trying to have to fight. But to your other question on how this actually ends and what the US's end game will be, and this is just me speaking on my personal opinion, but as long as it stays on the southern portion of the border, and as long as the fentanyl and other drugs decrease, I think that the U.S. government will probably be pretty happy with that fact. But that also is going to cause an increased violence, and there's even more concerns when it comes to that, when it comes to, how the Mexican government will react, or how the U.S. government would react at some point.
And I think that's the importance behind conversations like this, because there are people who are interested, and there might be people who aren't currently interested, but find themselves learning a bit more about the situation to the south of the border and how much more complex it is than it is being portrayed. And that's very important because the way it's laid out in American politics is just not really an accurate portrayal of what's actually happening. And when politicians offer very simple explanations or solutions to these issues, it's not necessarily something that is going to be achievable through that lens. So I really appreciate you coming on, Joe. And I would love to take this opportunity to ask you, to ask Stefano, if there are any last thoughts between the two of you that you would like to express that maybe we haven't covered.
I would say this, and this is kind of as a final thought, but you know, I think a lot of the reasons why it doesn't get the coverage it is because I don't think people understand how complex the situation is down in Mexico. I mean, it's a nightmare. And to be honest, like I ask questions all the time, just like I said earlier, right? For example, I'll see names of cartel leaders and plaza bosses, like Hearst from Borderland Beat. I go to her page almost every day to search because she has bios of a lot of these people to kind of get the historical context, right? When events happen in certain regions, I ask the questions. And here's a perfect example, Matthew, why it's complicated. I'll tell you why. There is at least 3 different groups called Operativa Barredora o Barredora in Mexico. There's a Barredora in Veracruz, which is Mayito Flaco. There's a Barredora in Puebla, which is CJNG. And then there's a Barredora gang in Tabasco that fights CJNG. And there's the Barredoras from Mayito Flaco in Veracruz fights CJNG there, right? You know how many people in Mexico go by the alias, like even Delta 10, right? You would think there is at least 2. One in Jalisco under CGNG, but then here's the problem because there's a Deltas of Jalisco New Generation, and then there's los Delta Pelones of los Chapitos in Sonora. Like that's the problem. Just that simple, dude. I have to DM accounts all the time, especially Mexican accounts, these Mexican OSIN accounts, but like all the time because of these inherently difficult conversations to try to figure out who's who in the zoo, especially their aliases. El Cien, El Cero, Uno. Okay, well, wait a minute. This is a Cero Uno that was here, but is it this person? Is this cartel? Okay, well, it could be both. And I think that's kind of the problem. But even if you try to go just not as depth as we do, right? Even just in an overview, like a 30,000-foot overview, I think the American media is just not prepared for it because they don't understand. And that's why you get sometimes terrible headlines such as cartels authorize hits on Border Patrol agents. My problem with that is what cartel are you talking about? Where? Because it's one thing in Sonora which borders Arizona, is completely different if it's Brownsville, Texas, and Matamoros, Tamaulipas. Like, they have nothing to do with each other, right? But I don't think the American media takes the time to actually go into detail, right? Because I think in many ways they analyze the Mexican cartel wars kind of like, you know, like the war on terror. Because but even the frustration part is even like within the global war on terror, right? I mean, we can go, Matthew. We talked about the Sahel, right? Yeah, there's various groups in the Sahel, but you can generally group them into two main ones that really matter: JNIM, which is the Al Qaeda affiliate, and then ISIS in the Sahel. And yeah, they have their own little subgroups and factions and all that, but they're kind of the two big bosses, two main groups that operate. That's not the situation in Mexico, because even the Sinaloa cartel doesn't exist anymore. Now, okay, which Sinaloa cartel are we talking about? Are you talking about los Chapitos or are you talking about los Mallitos Flacos? And I think the problem might even run into is the Jalisco New Generation cartel, right, led by El Mencho. It's not really clear that a family member of his is going to take over if he dies or gets captured. That's the problem in the Jalisco New Generation cartel, because El Chapo, when he was captured, his brothers took over, and then Mayo Zambada was his right-hand man, and then when Mayo Zambada was captured, his son took over. If you look at CJNG, you don't really see that. The family members of El Mencho are not the powerful figures as los Chapitos. And I think that's the problem. And going into those details, look at the FTO designated list, right? There were 6 Mexican cartels listed in there. There's some that probably easily could have been added to the FTO list, like Cartel de Santa Rosa de Lima cartel, or the Santa Rosa de Lima cartel out of Guanajuato, right? But most people don't know who these people are. And I think that's the problem, that the American media doesn't take the time. And even if they did, it would be a very I've done this for 4 years, and I don't consider myself an expert per se on the issues of Mexican cartels because of all the complex issues that are surrounding it. And I think that's the problem, and especially in a 24-hour news cycle where it doesn't go into the depths necessary. I think those issues, it's just not conducive for that type of in-depth analysis, and there's really not that political pressure to really get it. But Joe, go ahead.
So I'll leave with 2 things. One, I would say that the more people want to learn about what's going on in Mexico, there are so many phenomenal accounts. And Stefano alluded to this earlier, but you have accounts in Mexico based out of there that are regionally focused. And so if you don't care what's going on in Sinaloa, you can just hey, I just want to know what's going on the border. There's a multitude of accounts that will let you know way before any of the Mexican media, or definitely before the US media, what is going on in those regions. So and honestly, these days, not knowing Spanish isn't a problem, because you just click on a post and click translate and it tells you exactly what's going on. And then I would also say that, don't be shocked by smaller accounts that don't have a lot of followers having some of the best information out there, because there are definitely some people that just post amazing things and amazing information, but they don't have a lot of followers. So don't be scared of that. And then the last thing I would say is, for the 3 of us, one of the other things we're passionate about is definitely just watch the drone space for cartels. They're definitely going through the evolutions of drone use in conflict. And we've already seen likely the first FPV drone use in Mexico. And we wouldn't be surprised if we have at some point full videos from an FPV view being shared on Mexican social media accounts by the usual accounts. So once again, I want to thank you both for having me on here. 666 and Prop also appreciate you giving the time for us to join you on this post, or on this this little talk. So I appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. And this has been the Bottom Line Up Front on Artorias podcast, and we will talk to you soon.